Hi and welcome to another tutorial. This is Ash here. So I haven't introduced myself in other tutorials, but I wanted to give more of a homey and warm vibe to my videos. I'm trying out a few things since I'm new to YouTube, and yeah, I'd really appreciate your feedback in the comments. Let me know if you'd like me to, talk more and stuff. But anyways, on to our tutorial. First thing we'll be doing is going over simple geometric shapes, cubes, spheres, pyramids, and a cylinder. Then after that, we're going to do a more organic shape, kind of like a bean shape. It's very simple, but it's also a bit strange, so it gives a bit of a challenge. That would be step 2 after mastering shading simple geometric shapes. Then after we've studied shading an organic shape, I'm going to show you how to use cast shadows and reflected light to shade 3 shapes in space in relation to each other to give them that effect that they exist next to each other. First things first, you'll see I'm shading a cube here. I'm lagging a little bit behind because of my introduction, but you'll see that the edges that are closest to the light I've shaded a little bit darker. So that helps to give the flat surface a bit more of an angular form, or an angular illusion. There are 3 kinds of shadow that I want you to focus on as a beginner. So that would be your core shadow, your midtone, and your highlights. So with cubes, a core shadow usually exists on one plane, and then since you're only rarely able to see 3 faces of a cube, the midtone is going to be the plane that's sort of facing the light, but is at an angle towards it, and then there's the highlighted plane. So you'll see I'm still shading in the highlighted plane and giving it a bit of value because no shape is going to be completely white, or at least not unless you actually have white shapes. But all things have their own local value, and that's why I've added a little bit of grey even to the highlighted area. The next thing we'll move on to is the sphere. Okay, so I've already put down a sphere very lightly, and now I'm going around it with my hand. So while you're drawing curved forms, it's best to use your arm, your shoulder. Get your shoulder into it. Because doing it with your wrist, you wind up with a lot of wobbly lines, and it can be really tough to do that accurately. They say that only insane people can draw perfect circles. No, only people who know how to use their arms draw circles really well, and it's about practicing. Maybe all the practice drives you a little bit to insanity. Anyways, what I'm doing here, you'll see I've created a really dark area on my sphere, and then there's of course the midtones and the highlights. So with the sphere, there's a core shadow, but unlike a cube, the core shadow is represented more by a line, and then from that core shadow there's a gradation towards the highlight, and then a gradation towards the bottom. So I've left what have I left? I have left a reflected light at the bottom of the sphere because I'm going to draw it resting on a surface. Now when it comes to light, even though there's the occlusion shadow that blocks out the light from one object, absorbing and reflecting all the light, blocks it out from the one beneath it, there's still a lot of bounce light. The particles of light are still bouncing around on different surfaces and reflecting and hitting others. So you'll see the way that I've shaded my sphere is using a mixture of hatching and cross-hatching. So I like to shade with my hatching following the contours of any shape. That helps to give it a more solid form. When you're shading, if you're doing a sphere, try to think about how the lines would look if you had to imagine a grid, like a web grid, and then try to shade along that. If you shade in the opposite direction of that grid, if you shade in the opposite direction of that grid, it can tend to make your shapes look a little bit flat. Alright, so now we're done with the sphere. Oh yes, one more thing with the sphere, or with any shape. The occlusion shadow is darkest at the core of the other shape, or at the core of the shape. So you'll see at the bottom of the sphere, it's really dark, but as the shadow sort of branches out, it gets lighter and lighter. Okay, next we'll be drawing a pyramid. So a pyramid is very similar to a cube, except usually you only see two sides, and the sides are also kind of aiming up to the light a bit more, so it makes it a little bit more interesting, but it's still quite simple. So next is the pyramid. The pyramid is quite similar to the cube since it has simple flat edges, and the edges, each edge, the one closest to the light of a face, will be slightly darker than the edge furthest from the light of that same face. Now, while drawing a cast shadow, all I did was took the base of the pyramid, so I drew the base out as if it were a cube, and then I halved the distance between both edges of the base, and then just found the middle and connected that. So you can stretch that out as much as you want, depending on which angle of light you're on. But yeah, it's also important to think about how your cast shadows look. Beginner, I just want you to focus on those three main types of shadows, which is the highlight, the core shadow, and the midtones. They help define the shape, and they help define the form the best. The other two are kind of like cherries on top. They're the icing on the cake, but you still need the base and, Alright, the last simple geometric form that we'll go through before moving on to the organic shapes is a cylinder. This is quite simple. You just start with a cube or a square shape, and then you apply the same to a cylinder as you do to a sphere. So think of it as a combination between a cube and a sphere. It's a flat 90-degree angled surface, but then it has a more subtle gradation and a core shadow. Alright, next thing we're going to do is the organic shape. Okay, so you'll see I created a really weird looking thing here. It's three combinations of a circle, or actually two. And then you connect these together and you create this sort of soft curve. Now when you're doing shading with an organic shape, it's important to remember that the soft curves of that edge are also going to be mimicked by the core shadow. So I've drawn a few contour lines to help you see exactly how the shape stretches and expands and contracts. Alright, so after I've drawn this organic shape, I start by shading the core shadow. So since it isn't just simply a sphere, but it also leads up into this sort of bean, or maybe like a bean bag. Yeah, okay, it's a bean bag shape. It's my bean bag shape. So this beanbag is going to have a core shadow that doesn't just follow up the bottom, but also up the side. And it's going to lead right up to the top, and then only dissipate, near the edge, furthest away from the direction of light. So I've drawn a little arrow pointing where the light is coming from, and you'll see that it also has more than one highlight because it has more than one edge that is facing the light in the same angle. I again used a series of hatching and cross-hatching to create my values. Now there are different shading techniques that you can use. So the hatching, cross-hatching, just squiggly lines. You could also use a blending stump to create smooth shadows. I like to do that when I'm drawing portraits. It helps give a really soft flesh tint to it. And what else are there? Well, those are the main ones. Hatching, cross-hatching, and then blending. But when you're hatching and cross-hatching, it's still important to try to follow the contours. So you don't want to be hatching a horizontal and then vertical line, but then your shape, say for example a cube, doesn't really have any completely horizontal lines. They're all slightly angled, maybe at 30 degrees. So when you're shading and cross-hatching, of course, if you're using a blending stump and you're just blending everything together, then you don't need to worry about your lines too much. But be careful not to press too hard on your paper, and also make sure that even before you're using your blending stump, you still want your shading to be generally consistent, and you want the hatching to still be close together, because when you use your blending stump, if your lines are too far apart, it might leave marks on your page, and it's really hard to get rid of those. Also drew two noses, but I decided to leave them out because that's a lot more complicated, and as a beginner I don't want you to focus on trying to do fancy stuff yet. I did, however, still draw the contour lines and show where the reflected light is, where the core shadow is, where the midtones and the highlights are. But anyways, the last step in our tutorial is going to be shading a cube with a cylinder on top and then a cone next to it. So we didn't shade a cone on its own. Boom, cone on its own. We didn't shade a cone on its own before, but it's essentially the same principle as shading a cylinder. All you're doing is taking one base and closing it off. Okay, so here you'll see I'm shading the cube, I'm also creating the cast shadow, and now I'm creating a cast shadow of the cylinder on top of the cube. So that carries down past the cube's shape and further off into the distance. And considering the direction of light, which is from the top right, the top of the cylinder will have more shadow on that edge, because the same with the cube, that one sharp edge, that edge closest to the top of the light, will be a little bit darker than the edge furthest from it. There's also reflective light from the cube bouncing onto the cylinder near the bottom. And that also lightens the bottom of the cylinder. Alright, so after we shaded the cylinder and cube, we'll start just by thinking about what surface the cube is on. So you'll see I've drawn really lightly a sort of octagonal surface. Imagine that it's a table, right? So your drop shadow is going to follow that same surface, and also with the cone. I just want to say thank you for watching the video so far, and if you do enjoy the video and you're finding it helpful, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you aren't already subscribed. You'll see with my tutorials I want to do something a little bit extra and a little bit outside of the box. So I'm not just going to teach you how to shade a box and a sphere and a pyramid, but I'm also going to show you what to do to shade or practice shading organic shapes. And then later on we're going to get even more complicated. So I want you to be able to start as a beginner and then get up to the point where you're like, holy crap, I can draw. Damn. So yeah, stick around if you're up for that. Lastly, I'm drawing a cone next to the cube, and the light source is going to bounce over the cone and affect the way that the reflected light from the cube is going to react. So you'll see I've added a bit more shadow to the bottom left corner of the darkest face of the cube in view. And that is the absence of light that is caused by the pyramid or by the cone shape.